So once again, thank you all for watching today. And the topic of my talk is the truth about prominent climate scares. And what I'm going to do is present the actual evidence regarding 10 of the most prominent climate scares you hear about in the mainstream media. But before I do, I want to revisit something I mentioned briefly in my introductory remarks. And that is the difference between attacking science and performing science. Because oftentimes when I present a presentation like this one, in which I will be showing you data, objective data, I'll be presenting material from peer-reviewed scientific articles, I'm described as attacking science. Attacking science is when you try to stifle scientific discussion and debate. Attacking science is what the Catholic Church did to Galileo. Attacking science is when you try to silence people and say that the issue has been decided and we will not discuss science anymore, or we will have a show of hands rather than analysis of scientific data. The scientists in this room, the scientists throughout the realist community, when they present data that contest the global warming emergency theory, that is not attacking science. It is performing science. It is adhering to the scientific method. And quite frankly, it's shameful when people say that we should not be scrutinizing asserted scientific theories, especially when they have significant public policy impact. This is the definition of the scientific method. We make observations, we formulate theories, and then we rigorously test those theories. We do so ourselves and we invite others to do the same. And if your theory proves to be invalid, it doesn't make you a bad scientist. Heck, by presenting a theory that might be true, and then finding out that it isn't true, we get closer to the scientific truth. And I hope that people will understand that when the scientists in this room and throughout the climate realist community present data that contradict an asserted message, that is performing science. It is doing a valuable scientific, just having valuable scientific impact. It is not attacking science. With that being said, this first slide I'd like to call your attention to. This was, I believe, at yesterday's COP25 meeting. Here in Spain, the acting prime minister said, quote, "Only a handful of fanatics deny the evidence." I find it frightening that we have politicians calling scientists fanatics. We've seen this happen in the past and not much good results. This is what they would like to do in the future. We have a politician here who I welcome, I encourage, I will welcome with open arms. Come here, Mr. Acting Prime Minister. Discuss and debate the science with, I'll let you choose any of the presenters here in this room. Heck, I'll let you choose anybody in the audience here. Have that discussion, have that debate, instead of trying to bully and vilify people for presenting scientific evidence. Now, I've chosen 10 specific climate alarms to debunk. I could do 100 or more because there's so many out there that deserve debunking. But let's start with the first one. This one, the first two I want to place special emphasis on. I hope you remember. The first is the pace of temperature increase, because that goes to the heart of the alarmist scare, the climate emergency, that we're facing accelerated, rapid, unprecedented warming of temperatures. And yet, if you look back at the first United Nations IPCC report, the IPCC predicted, quote, "The average rate of increase of global mean temperature during the next century is estimated to be about 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade." Now, climate realists, many of the folks in this room, looked at the data and saw that temperatures were increasing instead at about 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade. And among climate realists, the answer was, well, we expect a continuation. We don't see a reason for an acceleration. And we were vilified as deniers. We were vilified as mavericks and attacking science for daring to contest the United Nations saying we'll get 0.3 degrees Celsius warming per decade. But a funny thing happened. Time passed. It's now been approximately 30 years since that prediction, and we've been able to measure real-world temperatures. And as a result, the IPCC, now in their most recent report in 2018, says, quote, "Estimated anthropogenic global warming is currently increasing at 0.2 degrees Celsius, likely between 0.1 and 0.3 per decade." In other words, they have already met the climate realists, or as they say, the climate deniers. They've already met us in the middle. They've already acknowledged and admitted that they have overestimated the warming by at least as much as the skeptics if we were entirely wrong. And yet they continue to vilify. So we continue to hear the science is settled. Was it settled in 1990 when they overpredicted warming? Is it settled now when they've already admitted they were at least as far off as skeptic predictions? And oh, by the way, look at the graph on the right. Those are the real temperature measurements. And what we see is temperatures are rising at nearly 0.13 degrees Celsius per decade. So they'll probably have to readjust their 0.2 and come closer to the climate realists. Now, the next alarm that I'd like to debunk is that the hottest years ever. And this is another one that we hear so frequently in the media that I hope you'll keep this in mind and have it on hand to discuss with your friends, colleagues, family. We often hear that 9 of the 10 hottest years occurred in the last decade or something similar. Here's a National Geographic article from earlier this year. The last 5 years were the hottest ever recorded. Well, who can contest that? It's National Geographic. It's in the news. But a funny thing is that when the climate activists, what they define as, look at the words ever recorded. Because what they don't tell you is they are defining in their own mind the words ever recorded to be the last 100 years or so. And when pressed, they'll say, well, the reason is because that's when we've had a relatively global network of mercury thermometers, but scientists have been able to discern temperature going back more than 100 years. They get away saying ever recorded because they're talking the last 100 years. But let's look at the scientific evidence for temperatures going back in a more representative time period. This data, these charts, are presented by the European Science Foundation. It was published in the peer-reviewed journal Science. So again, this is a verifiable, credible representation of temperatures going back on the top left 100,000 years. On the top right, look at temperatures of the past 10,000 years. On the far right, we see temperatures of today. That small line that goes up at the very end, that is the unprecedented climate emergency that we're told is happening right now. And yet temperatures have been much warmer for most of the duration of human civilization. It's right there in the data. And in fact, the warming is nowhere near the pace or the extent of warming and cooling events in the past. On the bottom chart, we see temperatures of the past 2,000 years. Again, we see the warming at the far right of the past century, which still leaves us short of temperatures of the medieval warm period. So when you hear the 10 warmest years on record, keep in mind that they define the record rather loosely. And by the way, in case you would like to challenge the temperature data presented in the peer-reviewed journal Science, this is taken from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change itself. And it shows the same thing. What you see is temperatures. Look at the middle graph, temperatures of the past 10,000 years. On the far right, we see the unprecedented climate emergency where we're still cooler than temperatures have typically been. On the bottom chart, we see temperatures of the past 1,000 years, and we see that temperatures over the past 100 years have more or less gotten us close to where temperatures were 1,000 years ago during the medieval warm period, which was still cooler than temperatures of the past 10,000 years. So remember the importance of context regarding temperature increases. A third supposed crisis I'd like to address is the migrant crisis, because now it's being asserted that the reason we have people flooding the United States southern border is because we in the United States have caused this by creating a climate emergency that is drying up their crops and forcing them to flee because they can no longer farm on their lands and feed their people. So here's an article. This is from the UK Guardian last year. And it says that while violence and poverty have been cited as the reasons for the exodus, experts say the big picture is that climate change is forcing farmers off their land. Similarly, NBC News earlier this year, Central America's future, pray for rain or migrate. Ravaged by drought, farmers in rural Honduras and Guatemala live on the edge of hunger. And the articles go on to say how global warming is causing this drought that is causing farmers to live on the edge of hunger. Now, this article specifically mentions Honduras and Guatemala. A wonderful thing exists. That's the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, because they compile very precise data on crop production in countries throughout the world. So we can go look at the scientific evidence. Most people see these headlines in the news. They don't research it any more further because they don't have the time or the inclination. But we'll do that for you, and then you can share it with them. So Honduras and Guatemala. From the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, this is crop output, crop yields per hectare. So it's not just that people are devoting more land to crops. This is the yields on a specific area that is being farmed. What you see is a very significant and consistent long-term, mid-term, and short-term increase in crop production in Guatemala. It's hard to make the argument that global warming is causing people to flee Guatemala by reason of crop failures when there are no crop failures. Honduras, the pattern is even more striking. Here we see at the far right, we see crop production. Yields are setting new records virtually every year. And yet the mainstream media tells us that global warming is causing people to flood the southern border because in Honduras they can no longer feed themselves. It's just the opposite. To the extent that hunger and crop failures drive migration, drive refugees, global warming is lessening those pressures, lessening the pressures on migration and these harms rather than making them worse. And by the way, you might say, well, then maybe NBC News got it wrong. Honduras and Guatemala may be outliers, but the rest of Central America is suffering droughts and crop failures. Well, let's look at some of those other countries as well. Here's Costa Rica. Again, we see an increase in crop production, records being set very frequently, almost every year. Ecuador, the same thing. It is hard to argue that global warming is causing crop failures in Ecuador. Same thing in Mexico. We see a consistent long-term increase in crop production, records being set nearly every year. Nicaragua, same thing. Panama, the same thing. Where do these people get off making these claims when the scientific evidence shows just the opposite? The media and the climate activists are either ignorant of the facts or they're aware of them and deliberately misrepresenting them. I don't know which is worse, but global warming is certainly not making crop production worse and causing refugees. The fourth asserted crisis I'd like to address is national security. Here we have an article in National Geographic published in 2014. It says, we have to confront the growing impacts of climate change on our ability to feed ourselves. Helping to feed the world will contribute to peace and stability, which is in all our interests. Well, who can argue with that? Well, much like the other nations that I addressed, here's crop production, yields per hectare in the United States. Again, consistent increases, records being set nearly every year. To the extent that national security and global peace are affected by crop production here in the United States, as in the other nations that I showed you earlier, global warming is making us a more secure place and one less likely to be prone to the ravages of war and national aggression. Now, some people may say, okay, well, you presented a dozen or so nations. Perhaps you're cherry picking from the bunch. Well, here we have data compiled by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization for the world as a whole. By the way, look on the left. These are assertions from the United Nations. In 1990, the United Nations claimed, quote, patterns of agricultural trade could be altered by decreased cereal production in some of the currently high production areas. That's very scary sounding. We could be having crop failures across the world very soon. 25 years later in 2015, IPCC, to the media and to people reading their reports without looking at the data, validated their warning. Climate-related impacts are already reducing crop yields in some parts of the world. Well, I think the key word there is some parts of the world, and probably very few. I don't know, maybe a county in southern Alabama or two. That would be about it, because here we see on the right, we look at crop yields throughout the world as reported by the United Nations itself. And what we see is a consistent increase in crop production. We see records being set nearly every year. Yet people who are watching the news media, watching television shows, who are reading the IPCC reports without looking at the data, are led to believe that we're seeing impacts already on crop yields and we're seeing crop failures everywhere. It's just the opposite. Alarm number 6. This is one of my favorites. In 2019, National Geographic published an article, in 2012, National Geographic published an article on climate change in the Great Lakes. And the title is Warming Lakes, Climate Change and Variability Drive Low Water Levels on the Great Lakes. And the article asserted that water levels in the Great Lakes were very low, climate change is to blame, and this is horribly bad news because it's very important to have high water levels in the Great Lakes. Lower is bad, more is better. Here is data that presented by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The chart was produced by Dr. Roy Spencer. And what you see is a time spread of Great Lakes water levels. Now on the far right, you see a period shortly before the end where water levels were relatively low on Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Michigan, but about average on Erie and Ontario. It is in that period that we had the article here by National Geographic sounding an alarm about low water levels and blaming climate change. Now, those lower water levels were not record lows, and they were not across the Great Lakes. But okay, sure, you could make an assertion and then see what the data show. But then look at the far right, the data for all 5 lakes. Now we see Superior, Huron, Michigan, Erie, and Ontario. When you look at those 5 Great Lakes as a whole, there is currently the most water ever recorded in the Great Lakes, ever recorded. So in 2012, National Geographic said, water levels are low, this is terrible, climate change emergency. So do you do you think that maybe National Geographic or others in the media have now corrected their story? You think maybe we're seeing a lot about how global warming is causing these wonderful increases in Great Lakes water levels? Well, actually, they have addressed it. This is from Physics World. And the title, after seeing the record level of water in the Great Lakes, why are water levels on the Great Lakes fluctuating so wildly? Now that we have the wonders of more water than we've ever had, we've defeated the horrors of low water levels. This is a bad thing too, because global warming makes everything bad. So when we have record water levels, why is it fluctuating so wildly? Alarm debunked number 7, hurricanes. We heard earlier much about the hurricanes and what's happening regarding climate change and the lack of impacts. But this is an article from CNN published earlier this year. The title is Climate Change Makes Some Storms Like Dorian More Dangerous. Now, in addition to what Stanley Goldenberg presented earlier, let's go back to the United Nations itself, because although it's an overly alarmist organization, every now and then they get it right. And they got it right on hurricanes. According to the United Nations itself, this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change interim report just last year. Quote, there is low confidence in any observed long-term, i.e. 40 years or more, increases in tropical cyclone activity, i.e. intensity, frequency, duration. The IPCC says we don't see any signal. And if you look at the data, this is hurricane frequency, it's not there either. But the media reports it as a crisis anyway. And then they tell us we're attacking science and attacking the United Nations when we're merely reporting what the United Nations itself has published. Alarm number 8, tornadoes. Here's an article from the Washington Post. Extreme weather has made half of America look like Tornado Alley. Oh my goodness, half of America is now a Tornado Alley. That sounds frightening. That sounds devastating. Let's look at the actual data. This is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. On the right, you see tornadoes starting on the left in 1954, going through 2014. We certainly don't see any increase. And if you look back over the past 50 years or so, we see a pretty significant decline. And the IPCC itself says in its 2018 report, there is low confidence in observed trends in small spatial scale phenomena, such as tornadoes. But I guess that doesn't deter the Washington Post, does it? Good facts will never ruin a good scare. In fact, here we have on the right, this chart is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Again, objective data. These are the strong tornadoes, because frequently people will say to me, well, James, but they're making them worse. We may not get as many, but they're worse. Well, here we have the strong tornadoes. It's even more striking, the decline in strong tornadoes as our climate modestly warms. Alarm number 9, drought. Here's an article from Carbon Brief. The title is Climate Change is Already Making Droughts Worse. Similarly, the Washington Post earlier this year, title is In a Warming World, Evidence of a Human Fingerprint on Drought. The USA Today covered the same report. The secret was in the trees. Humans are making droughts worse. Well, they were citing a study. They're referencing a study in Nature. And so I went to Nature and actually looked at the study. And at first I thought, wow, it must be true. Because here's the title of the study itself. 20th century hydroclimate changes consistent with human influence. Yet when I read the study, I found something funny. Yes, early in the 20th century, they found a correlation between warming temperatures and drought. But here from 1950 to 1975, according to the study, quote, a negative trend indicates that the data and fingerprint are increasingly dissimilar. In the middle of the 20th century, these trends become negative. So from 1950 to 1975, they had the opposite of what they expected if climate change is causing drought. Then, in recent decades, 1981 to the present, the study reports the signal of greenhouse gas forcing is, quote, not detectable at the likely level over background noise. So now we have the past 70 years in which there's either been no signal of climate change being connected with drought or a contradictory signal. And yet, what happens? The media and even the authors of the study themselves say, well, we can go back to 1940 and we see that there's a signal. Humans contribute to drought, human climate change. In fact, it's just the opposite. But it doesn't bother, it doesn't interrupt a good scare, does it? And just to further support the point, this is from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The yellow bars are drought, very dry conditions in the United States. This chart goes back a little more than 100 years. It says January, but that's essentially annual for 10-year spans in each block. And what you see that's remarkable, look at the last time that more than 40% of the United States experienced very dry conditions. You have to go back approximately 40 years to find such prevalence of drought. And if you go back beyond that 40 years, that happened quite frequently. We are now in the longest period in recorded history. I'll use that phrase that the climate alarmists like to use. We are now in the longest period of recorded history without the United States experiencing at least 40% of its land coverage undergoing drought. That's something we should be thankful for. That's happening as temperatures moderately increase. Similarly, as reported in USA Today, using National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration data, just recently, if climate change is causing such droughts, what we shouldn't be seeing is this. Drought in the U.S. fell to a record low this week, with just 6.1% of the lower 48 states currently experiencing such dry conditions, federal officials announced Thursday. Of course, it doesn't stop the Washington Post and the New York Times and USA Today from claiming that climate change is making droughts worse. Finally, number 10. Recently, you will see on the campaign trail many of the Democratic presidential candidates who are trying to make climate change a signature issue. I've heard over and over again from the candidates, they'll be visiting Detroit or Washington State or wherever it may be, and they'll say, here in Detroit, here in Michigan, here in Washington, we can see with our own eyes, I've seen with my own eyes, that global warming is accelerating and it's getting worse. Well, back in 2005, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration became operational, the CRN, Temperature Station Network. This basically, the CRN,
Climate Reference Network.
Climate Reference Network. I know it, but in the middle of a talk, sometimes it slips my mind. Thank you, Anthony. The Climate Reference Network. And what we have is data going back to 2005. And these are stations that are immune from the corrupting influences that Anthony Watts described earlier. These are highly reliable temperature stations. And what you see is that temperatures now are no warmer than they were 15 years ago. You don't see that at all. And in fact, if you look at the chart, not quite at the far right, where you see some warming in 2015, 2016, that's a result of an El Nino, which is a short temporary event that has nothing to do with global warming. So again, when you hear that the United States is experiencing accelerating temperatures, it's simply not true. This is U.S. federal government data. This isn't my opinion. This is the data. This is performing science. Going back further, you may say, well, perhaps we're just in a 15-year short-term lull. Anthony Watts discussed how the temperature data is doctored. This chart is presented by Tony Heller on the Real Clear Science website. In blue, you see the actual temperature measurements throughout the United States going back on the left from 1900 to the present. And what you see is approximately 1930 and during the 30s, temperatures were at least as warm as they are now, according to the actual on-site temperature measurements. You don't see any significant warming. The red line is what happens after they've doctored the data and tell us that we have rapidly accelerating temperatures. It doesn't appear anywhere in the older data, and as we've seen in the previous chart, it shows up nowhere in the current data. So that's number 10 debunked, accelerating U.S. warming. I'd like to final just by mentioning one thing I hope you'll all pay attention to. What you see here is a screenshot. This is climateataglance.com. And if you were to go there right now, you would see, get ready, something really cool is coming soon. We are going to be producing short one-page summaries of the climate science regarding particular global warming subtopics. On the right, you see Climate Change Reconsidered 2. Over the years, the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change has published several comprehensive scientific volumes presenting the evidence supporting climate realism. Thousands of pages, thousands of references to objective data in the peer-reviewed literature. However, the books are pretty thick. Most people don't get a chance to read them, digest them, etc. So what we're doing, you see on the left, that's a draft of one of our Climate at a Glance one-page summaries. What we're going to do is we're going to condense it down, citing and linking to the objective scientific data and peer-reviewed literature, where people can see at a glance what is going on regarding hurricanes, tornadoes, record temperatures, you name it. That we hope to be producing within the next couple of months. Check that website, and I think we're going to have a tremendous impact on the climate science debate, and more importantly, on getting closer to scientific truth. So with that in mind, I thank you very much for your attendance and for watching my presentation.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel and consider donating to the Heartland Institute to support more vibrant free markets, greater individual liberties, and more videos like this one.